Hello and welcome to this video on how to adjust leaf switches. I've got a few leaf switches here to show you and give you a little tour of how these things work. We'll start with this little guy here. This is the most common leaf switch that needs to be adjusted. This is a leaf switch that is behind the slingshots on the playfield. This is very typical. The rubber band of the slingshot rests right on the top of this, and when the ball barely hits that slingshot, you know how sensitive those are. That little contact right there that you can see is closing right there, that's what senses the ball hitting the rubber band. There's two wires underneath there that are hooked to this, one on each side, and what this does is it completes a circuit so that the machine knows that a ball has hit this and fires the slingshot. Sometimes it can be as simple as one of these wires has come off if one of your leaf switches is not working. But in slingshots, most commonly, you'll have one that rapid fires. It's firing when you're not even touching it. And that is because this is not adjusted appropriately, and the rubber band that's pushing on this is holding it closed. And it's stuck closed, and the slingshot is just rapidly firing. That's usually because this whole mechanism is too far forward this direction, and it needs to be bent backwards. Now, this leaf switch, you can see, has come out of a game. It's been through the ringer. It's old. It's been bent around a bit. But it does illustrate that on one side, there's usually a functional part that moves. And on the other side, there's usually a stop portion that'll run into. And that's almost always supported, with the exception of a couple of areas, almost always supported by a little rigid metal piece that this can heavily lean into, and that doesn't move very much. So when you push this back hard, that piece just doesn't move. That's rigid. So you can gently adjust these flimsier pieces, and this is the tool that you would use to do that if you have one. You can order these on Marco Specialties. They're a very nice little tool. It comes with 3 different formats that you get for different angles and different reachability. This is the most usable one. If you don't have that tool and you're in a pinch, you can just use some needle nose pliers to get in and make adjustments. The key to making these adjustments is that you make very small movements so that you don't overdo it and you don't bend up your leaf switch. So let's just say we're gonna bend this a little further away. You can put this right at the base, make a real small adjustment, and bend that out just a little bit. That little tiny change I've made has made quite a bit of difference in that gap. Sometimes you have to adjust the other side, however, the side with the rigid bar. And if you can get your adjuster tool on both, that's fine. But oftentimes you're only able to get it on the one side, and you may have to adjust just the hard metal piece. So we will slip onto that, try to bend that backwards. This particular adjuster doesn't fit on that, so I'll just use my needle nose. And then you could bend the whole thing backwards just a little bit. Again, making very small movements so that you don't overdo it. Now I've got a pretty sizable gap there. That may not be favorable, and that may not be what I intended to do, but at least it shows you how you can either push this one back this way, or push either one of them closer together. The key is to make very small changes. You make changes down here at the base if you can. Sometimes there'll be a little kink from somebody being too rough with it, and you've got to straighten that out. But ultimately, the goal is to adjust the position between these two pieces so that they're apart and they're not stuck closed or constantly touching. Every once in a while, you'll go in and find that one of these is broken off, and you've got to replace the whole switch. That's where you'd have to unsolder these and solder them back on. Some of these switches come with a little diode here that is current specific, and you need to pay attention to those. They'll have a little gray line on them. You can usually reuse the one that's on there and just take a picture of it first and unsolder that and solder it back to the port where it was before you changed anything. Here's another example of a leaf switch. This is a target that goes under the playfield, or goes on the playfield. This sticks up from the playfield and the ball hits this target. When the ball contacts the target, you can see that's the area that it closes right here. that's where the switch makes contact. This one is significantly stiffer because it requires a little bit more contact to get the closure. You don't want your targets to be super sensitive where a ball just barely brushes it and you get credit. It has to actually make good contact. So in this case, you've got a heavier piece of metal on this side and on this side. There's also some cardboard that they've got in there, some little paper that also protects this metal from grounding out. If you really hit this too hard and push it all the way back into this back metal piece, you might ground this whole thing out, and that wouldn't be good. So they've got these little pieces of cardboard in there on some of the older school games to prevent that from happening. Also, there's this little piece of rubber or weather stripping in here that gives it a backstop and some cushion so that it doesn't keep going. It hits that, kind of squishes in, and that's as far as it'll go. So if you have a target that's not working, you can always adjust this to make sure that it's either open enough or it's not stuck closed. You may have to adjust either side, and you also may have to adjust the metal support on either side with your tool or with some pliers. Oftentimes it's easier to just take the switch off of the playfield with the 2 screws, undo those, bring it out, and you can work with it in your hand a little bit better. Sometimes if you're lazy, you can sneak one of these tools up in there and get it adjusted without doing that. You'll just have to see how it goes for you. But remember, small movements, just a little tiny change does quite a bit. Here's another example of a target. You can see that this one's very close together. This cushion is not as worn out, but you can see that this piece of metal here keeps this from going forward at all. The piece of metal behind the other leaflet switch keeps the other one from going back at all. Sometimes you need to clean in between these 2 contacts if they're really dirty with just a little bit of alcohol. Clean off the contacts. Here's another leaf switch that's on your flipper mechanism that's quite interesting. These break quite a bit, and you'll see an EOS error on your pinball machine, which is end of stroke switch error, and that's because this switch has gone bad. This particular one has a real rigid back, so there's only 2 pieces on this one, and the way these work, I've got one here. It's kind of dirty and dusty that came out of a machine. This is what moves when your pinball flipper flips. This coil turns, this thing swivels. Your pinball flipper's on the other side of this, up on top of the playfield. But you'll see this little arm right here goes over and contacts that switch and closes it. So the machine knows, oh, I've thrown the flipper all the way up, it's all the way extended, and now I can stop because I know where it is. If that switch breaks, the pinball machine doesn't know how far that the flipper's gone, and it doesn't get that feedback of the end of stroke. Usually, this piece of metal is broken on that, and you've got to rebuild this flipper mechanism. Usually this is the problem. So you'd take these screws out, and you'd replace this whole flipper bat with this whole flipper mechanism with a rebuild kit if this piece is broken. Sometimes the switch is also broken, or the switch breaks as well, or this spring can be broken. So you can look under there and make sure that, that as this thing flips, it's still making good contact with the switch. Either this arm is broken, either the switch is broken, or the spring is out, and that's why you're not getting good function. So you may have to replace that if that's broken, and that'll also come in the flipper rebuild kit typically. So that's the end of adjusting a leaf switch. Please let us know if you have any other questions.